Welcome to another month of Skill Builders. I'm Joyce Lundrigan.
And I'm Joanne Knight. And I am really excited about the project that we have for this month. It is a tag-along tote bag, and you can see on the screen the picture of the first sample that we did. This is the front, and this is the back of it with the strap. We're going to show you how to quilt this out using draw pattern. Joyce, what else are we going to learn?
Using draw pattern, formerly known as point-to-point, we're going to use patterns for different shapes, like flying geese, half-square triangles, parallelograms, regular triangles, squares. We're going to concatenate patterns. But first, let's go over the rules of draw pattern.
What I'm going to do is turn the grid on so that I can show you the basic rules of a point-to-point or a draw pattern. In version 6 and previous versions of Creative Studio, you had a little bullseye as an icon for your point-to-point. Now, draw pattern has its own icon and draw line has its own icon. So they've been separated for version 7. Markers are very important for you to be able to look at them and tell whether a pattern is a point-to-point or not. If I left-click and drag this pattern to the screen, the markers tell you that the pattern starts on the left and it ends on the right, and that's the basic rules of a point-to-point. It doesn't have to be at the bottom of the pattern. It can be through the center of the pattern. It just has to start on the left and end on the right and be on the same horizontal plane. That's the basic rules of any point-to-point. If we scroll down in our project, this double crosshatch that you're getting for the back of the tote bag has 2 markers, and that tells us that that pattern will not sew continuously. It's not designed to sew continuously, and it's not going to. It's going to sew this pattern, it's going to stop, and it's going to tie off. If we go back to our pattern tab and you look at this pattern, which was Joyce's all-in-one for July, this pattern has a split marker, and that means that the start and end of that pattern are in the same spot. And while we're talking about it, we set up the project for you with your patterns in there. But please don't forget to import those patterns into your pattern tab in your database and not just work from your project. These are very useful patterns that you're going to be able to use in many other projects and many other situations. So we want you to be able to take advantage of them. Joyce, isn't that going to be located as a little video in their Begin Here document that they get every single month?
Correct. There's a link in the Begin Here, so we want to remind everyone, if they haven't read through the Begin Here and browsed through the quilting instruction PDF, that it would be a good idea to review those first.
Yeah, there's a lot of really useful information there. What Creative Studio will do with a draw pattern, a point-to-point pattern, is it will maintain that aspect of that pattern depending on how far you click. So Joyce is going to show you what we mean by that on the screen.
So you cannot take a pattern that is on the CAD and then click on Draw Pattern. You have to take a pattern from the Project tab and then click on Draw Pattern to make it work. So I'm going to take one where the pattern has the start and the end on the base of the pattern, select it, draw pattern, and for this I'm going to turn my grid snap on, and by clicking from left to right I can repeat these patterns, but I do not have to click on the same horizontal plane. I could continue and I could click these patterns in any direction that I want, because it's a point-to-point.
The distance that she clicks is going to determine the size of that pattern. So what she's going to do now is she's going to click one and it's going to be a little short distance, and she's going to click the next one and it's going to be a longer distance. You see the different sizes in those patterns? but yet they are symmetrical both in height and in width because maintain aspect is on, and you find that in your pattern properties. You also notice that you do not have to have a boundary whenever you do draw pattern. We highly suggest that you do a boundary, because otherwise when you look at that screen you don't really know if those patterns are going to be inside the area that you want them to be or not. So this is not a pattern to boundary. Boundary is going to be nothing more than a visual for you whenever you are clicking these out.
Correct. And another thing we should point out is that you can click a set of patterns, and I'll click 2 or 3, and then if I right click on my mouse I can close the drawing, and you'll see on your machine keypad the bottom center button is close drawing, but you'll see I still have my crosshair here, so I can continue clicking until I both right click once to close and then right click again to exit.
And that's what you would do with the mouse. If you're at the machine head, you would close the drawing with that same center bottom button and then exit with that center bottom button. So that makes it really easy if you want these patterns to click continuously, or if you want to click a row of them or a section of them and then stop and click a totally different section in another place. You will also notice that there are no teal markers in between these patterns, which means that they are going to sew continuously all the way through that quilt. Separate one of those, please, if you don't mind. Just move it over. Now, you see how that teal marker shows up? That means that those first 2 patterns are going to sew, and they're going to sew continuously. When that third pattern comes up, it's going to tie off after the second one has quilted and tie back on when the third one starts to quilt when you hit the continue button. Those teal markers tell you that those patterns are not going to quilt continuously.
Those are good points, Joanne. And another point, and we frequently hear people say that they would combine patterns and that would help them sew continuous. So if I were to select all of these patterns and I go up and click on combine pattern, these patterns are now combined, but you'll see that there's still a teal marker. So unless those patterns are snapped together, then combining does not make them so continuous.
No, it's still going to tie off whenever it needs to tie off, because there is a visual gap between the 2 of those patterns. And if they were closer together, it still might tie off. So combining them does not help you in that situation. Combine those patterns. If it cannot sew a sewable stitch from that second pattern to that third one, then it's not going to.
So I can take this pattern here, and I'm going to use little nudge, which is Alt arrow, and move that ever so slightly. So visually these still look like they are, and there is no teal marker, which means that I haven't...
It is within one sewable stitch.
Right. So if I move that just a little bit more, now you see the teal marker, but from a distance you might think those would still stitch, but they won't.
They won't. And even combining them is not going to do any good. So let's go over to our little design group 2 and show you where we're going. This is the front of what our little tote bag, our tag-along tote bag looks like. And this is how it's going to quilt out. And we're going to show you all of these different shapes that are in this piece. So the first thing that Joyce is going to do is show you how we created that line work that there is in the outside border, that darker border. Now we have given you that pattern, but she wants to show you, and I think it's a super idea, how she created that, because it's a really useful technique that you can use in a lot of other projects. So let's get started.
We've drawn the boundaries for the front borders on our bag, and I'd like to show you how I drew this pattern so that you can draw similar ones to use in other projects. I'm going to change the grid size to 0.25 and click on Draw Line. Remember, Draw Line is a draw feature. I have snaps on, and I'm going to click a point on it, and it's a grid point because I have snaps on. And it doesn't matter how wide I make this line, but I'm going to click over a couple of inches. I'm going to click down a 1/4 inch, back over to the left, and I want the left-hand side to be even so that if you were to put this on a boundary edge or something, that, or use fill for it, that it's even. So click down 3/4 of an inch across to the same point where you click the first set of lines, down a 1/4 inch, back across, and just like Draw Pattern, you right click once to close draw and right click again to exit.
And all of those clicks that you made whenever you were drawing that line were all left clicks with the mouse.
Good point.
Because you're doing this on the actual computer screen and not with the head of the machine, so you're designing this with your mouse and a left click. You don't right click until you close it and exit.
Correct. So with that pattern drawn, then I can marquee select, right click, go all the way to the bottom and save pattern, and then I can give it a name and save it to my pattern database and have it to use in the future, and then save and close. I already have a copy, so I'm going to cancel and not save it. So then when it comes time to use this pattern, then we can take this, and the way I set this up was to set it about a 1/4 inch, and we have the grid at a 1/4 inch. So I set it a 1/4 inch away from the inside boundary.
Because we're going to have seams on the outside and we don't want our lines going up into those seams.
Correct. Now it's important that when we're stretching this pattern to fill this border, that we use the side arrow, because the corner arrows will distort the size of the pattern, and we want to keep the height at a 1.25 inches. So all you do is to grab this side arrow and hold your left mouse button down until it reaches the boundary that you want it to, and then you can stitch that pattern. So this is a good time to show you the difference. The pattern I have selected here was one that I dragged onto the CAD. So this pattern, if I right click, and for this pattern, if I click on properties, this little I, and look at the speed and the SPI, it's what my project definitions are for all patterns that are in my project. So I'll save and close that. Now this pattern here was the one that we drew on the CAD, and if I click on pattern properties for that, you'll see that the speed is 2. And that is the draw line speed from your controller definitions.
That's the main difference, and that's what seems to be a little bit confusing, is that even those patterns look just alike. One of them is a saved pattern, and one of them is a draw line that was done right there on the computer screen. The other thing to make sure and notice is when Joyce would drag a pattern to the computer screen, to the CAD screen, patterns always come in at a 0 angle.
So I'm going to delete this pattern that we've drawn, and then drag this pattern back up and lay it in at the 1/4 inch margin from that boundary. And we can stitch that one.
We've got this part quilted out, and the really easy way for us to be able to place the other 3 sides in version 7 is to select this pattern, go up to our menu strip and copy, then we're going to left click on paste and hit the space bar 1 time. You see that? Now I'm going to hit the space bar again because the start and end is at the bottom. We want the start and end to be at the top. So I'm going to place that right here, left click to place it, and right click to stop that function. Select the pattern, bring this down on the handles the way that Joyce explained to you, and this one up. We want it to start sewing at the top because that way it is stabilizing what we have already sewn. And that's why we're placing that way.
Right, and taking it to the edge of the quilt or out into the binding area gives it a really good look with this like plaid corner, and made a corner, so this works really well for small sashings.
Right, that you don't have a corner for. It's really easy and really fast to set up, and it gives it a really nice look in that corner, and you don't have to worry about the corner.
And you'll find that this is going to work really well when we get to the construction part of the tote as well.
Joyce, let's quilt that part out.
Alrighty.
That side's quilted out. I am going to hit paste again with a left click of the mouse. I'm going to hit the space bar to rotate the pattern, pick it up and move it over to this side, and I did a terrible job of clicking out that boundary. Adjust my handles because this is a rectangular shape. You've got your crosshair on that seam line?
I have my crosshair on the seam line.
We may have to do a little leaning on this one. You see how easy it is to adjust this pattern to whatever length or height that we want it to be? Such a versatile piece. We again want to start quilting at the top because we want to stabilize that top. And then we're going to put the bottom piece in, and then all of our outside will be stabilized. And that's why we started with the outside before we did the inside quilting on this piece. Okay, last side, and that's the bottom. You will notice that I don't have to copy anything else. I can just simply left click on paste because Creative Studio is going to hold that copy until you replace it with something else. This one does not have to be rotated because it's going to sew from left to right, but I am going to pull it up a little bit to be able to have it get a little bit closer to that 1/4 inch. Adjust my handles a little bit, and now this one is ready to quilt out, and we can go on to the center. Now that we have all of this quilted out, we're going to start a new quilt group because we want to keep a nice visual of what we're going to do for our boundaries, number one, and number two, when we get to the back, we have a nice little trick to show you. So to keep everything nice and clean, we're going to start a new quilt group, and I'm going to change the grid back to 3 inches because it'll make it easier for you to see. What we're going to do now is this top row of triangles, these white triangles right here. When you're looking at the picture of our piece, color is going to kind of dictate what you're going to do first. We used a darker thread to do this outside border, and if we were going to quilt these colored areas with that same darker thread, then we would quilt them first to be able to not have to change thread so much. But what we're going to do is a nice clean white thread, and I think it is a so fine that we're using, and we're going to use the white for the entire area, so it doesn't really matter where we start clicking. For consistency's sake, we're going to start with these white triangles right here at the top and place the pattern in there. So we're going to go to that new quilt group, and Joyce is going to show you how to click out that boundary. Remember, we talked about that the boundary is nothing more than a visual. We don't need it for pattern to boundary. So if I go back to this quilt group, in order to save yourself some time, instead of doing 3 separate boundaries for these white triangles, it's easier just to do 1 boundary for the entire row.
Right, and because this is a small piece, then we can be pretty sure that for 3 small triangles, the boundary is not going to be affected, or the quilting is not going to be affected by shrinkage. If this were a larger quilt, then we would click boundaries in smaller sections.
Slow the machine down a little bit when we got to those sections. You're going to trust your clicking when you're doing draw pattern or point to point. You're going to trust your clicking, so make sure that your laser light is synced with your needle and they are in the same sync, so that when you click and you're going off of your laser light, you know that that's where your needle is going to stick.
So I'm going to, from the machine head, click on Draw Boundary and start in the upper left corner. Click along the inside of that first triangle down to the point, and up to the top, and start down the side of the second triangle.
Now she can still make as many clicks as she wants to, because this is a regular boundary, but what she's doing is just doing one boundary for all three triangles instead of individual boundaries.
Till I get to the end, and then I click along that inside border seam, and I'm clicking at the seam line, and we have our boundary.
Now we have to look at how we're going to place the patterns. We're going to be dealing with the Pearl Bloom point-to-point pattern. This Pearl Bloom pattern is a flying geese pattern, and you can see that the start and end goes through the center of the triangle. We want the one where the start and end is at the base of the triangle. And we told you earlier that the direction that you click determines how those patterns are placed. So for this particular one, the triangle is going to be facing down, so we're going to start clicking with the machine head on the right side and go right to left, so that those triangles will fall right in that boundary that we have chosen, and they will so continuously.
So I will mode over to Draw Pattern, place my first click where I want it to start. The second click is right in between the first and second triangle, across to the next one, and then over to the end.
Notice that you have a pink image that comes on the screen. That's new for Creative Studio, where you're able to see that pattern and how it's going to be placed, and it's pink until you make that next click. We can see that because we clicked with the head of the machine, our patterns are not exactly where we want them to be. If you wanted to move all of these patterns at the same time, you could marquee select them, use your F8 handle, and using this one little F9 purple handle, you could move all three of them up at the same time. You could also take this little gray pie piece and move all three of them at the same time if you needed to move all three of them. It's a little bit temperamental. If we scroll in really close, according to where our clicking is, we've lost a little bit of the points in the piecing, and that's what you're going to have sometimes in some of these patterns. But Joyce, I think that right now may be a really good time for you to show them that little trick that you came up with a couple of years ago, which is so smart. So let's take them out and let's show them how you do that.
Okay. When we were given concatenation in Creative Studio, I think it was version 5, we could concatenate. The first thing occurred to me was how to concatenate geometric line and a triangle so that you can kind of jump over the tips of those bad piecing. And I don't know if that was because I was doing an awful lot of bad piecing quilts of my own, or I had customers who were, bless their heart, quilters at the time. But I'm going to remove these by selecting and deleting them all. And then I need to add geometric line to the project. So I'll go to my pattern tab And you'll see it has a little yellow star, which means that geometric line I have tagged in my pattern list as a favorite. With a double left click, then it will add the pattern to the project, and you can see down in the prompt box that the pattern has been added. Sometimes you can click on a pattern and you don't hear the little pop, which means that it hasn't been added. So another clue, other than you don't get the little pop, is this pattern or this prompt won't be there if the pattern wasn't added. So we'll go back over to the project tab, and first I'm going to select that triangle pattern again, which is right here, and then I'm going to hold my control key down and select geometric line, and from the head of the machine I'm going to tab over to draw pattern.
Because geometric line is an actual pattern. It's different from draw line.
Right, we can't concatenate two functions in the toolbar, but we can concatenate two patterns in the project tab.
Correct.
So with draw pattern selected, then I will place my first click, and the first pattern that I selected in the project tab is the first pattern placed. So now I will go over to that, and then I am going to, the next click is going to be the geometric line, and so I'll move across that point that's lost and click again. Then I place my next triangle.
That geometric line is now going to become the stitch in the ditch to be able to go across those points that were lost, and that's going to better place those triangles in those different boundaries that we need them to be in.
Right. And then complete the series of patterns and close and exit. Now we have patterns that have been placed in here much better.
Much better than the first time.
And I can select them and move them back in with the purple handle just a little bit. And I can, if I need to, I can ever so slightly adjust those so that they fall in the tip.
You'll find that F12, the gray handles, are a little bit less fussy when you use them in the F8 universal handle, where you get all three of them. It also gives you all three handles at one time without having to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that's new for version 7.
Right. I'm going to fix this one a little bit more to the center.
It bothers you?
It did. And now we have the patterns ready to stitch, and the geometric line, because it is a pattern and not draw line, will stitch at the same speed as the triangles. So if it was a long line and it was going to fall in the ditch, you might want to select it. But because it's only a couple stitches wide, then we don't need to worry.
But let's take just a second and show them an easy way to be able to fix that. It's important to know, if we scroll through our patterns by hitting our greater than and less than, you see that? That's the little geometric line. That's the triangle again, that's the little geometric line, and that's the triangle. In order to have the geometric line pattern stitch at a slower speed, if this were a bigger gap, you would hold down your left mouse button and you would marquee select from left to right. When you marquee select from left to right, you have to completely cover the pattern for the pattern to be selected. Doing it this way, the only thing that we have selected are those little bits and pieces of geometric line. Left click on the letter I, and this is where you could change the speed of the geometric line, and then it would stitch the triangle at the regular project speed, slow down for the geometric line, stitch the next triangle at the project speed. It's a whole lot better to do that and slow it down if you had that geometric line at a long stretch. We just had a little bit. So now we're ready to quilt this out and get this one done, and then we can go on to the next part.
And that tip of Joanne's is terrific, because by selecting both of those little geometric lines and clicking on the pattern property for the selected patterns, She's multi-changing both patterns at the same time so that she did not have to go in and individually change each one.
So let's quilt this part out. Now that we've got these stitched out, another advantage to having one boundary is all we have to do is just hit the letter K on our keyboard and it selects that boundary, and we hit the word delete and it deletes that boundary. And now, because those boundaries were just one instead of 3 individual triangle boundaries, it's a whole lot faster to delete. We also want to get rid of those because they may no longer be located in the same position as they were after quilting, and we want to be able to click out new boundaries so that we have a really good visual of where we need to go. So if we refer back to our picture, what we're going to be doing now is these half square triangles that we have in part of this first row, but we're also going to include this parallelogram because we want this to quilt out continuously going all the way across this particular piece. So I'm going to go back to our group and I'm going to click out a boundary, and you'll see what I'm going to do on this one to be able to once again have one boundary instead of all individual ones on this quilt. I'm writing the high side. This is going over the green part. Now I'm going to go down to the red part of the parallelogram and back up the other side.
Out.
I'm going to still hit that center bottom button on the keypad to close the drawing and hit it again to exit the drawing. Boundaries are still selected, and the reason that they're selected is because Creative Studio is going to assume that you want to do pattern to boundary. We don't necessarily, so all you would need to do is just left click the computer screen and it would go away, and now it's not that bright blue.
So we have the boundaries drawn, and let's go to the design group and look at the patterns that we need to place. We want to stitch this group or this row continuous. And so even though these wings of the flying geese look like they would accommodate half square triangles, they could, but the stitching path would not be continuous because we've thrown in these parallelograms. So if we clicked half square triangles here to here to here, then when we need to point for the parallelogram, it wouldn't stitch continuous. So what we can do is to treat these half square triangles as a triangle, regular triangle, and fill them by clicking across the baseline of the triangle. Let's look at the patterns that we need. We need 2 of these triangles, so 2 of the same. Then we have the parallelograms, and we can tell you that you can't use the opposite, so you can't concatenate 2 of the same pattern because they're kind of a mirror image of each other. So we've given you the one pattern and the mirror image as a separate pattern. And then we need 2 of the triangles again. So in your project tab, you have the curved bloom triangle, but you only have 1 copy because that's what we've brought in or added to the project for you. So we're going to click on the curved bloom, right click, and duplicate pattern. And doing that, CS throws the pattern a second copy, and you can see curved bloom 1 was added next to the original pattern. So let's go back to our quilt group, and I need both copies of the triangle, and those will be placed first. So holding my control key down, I select the first curved bloom triangle and then click on the second. Then I need to scroll up, and it doesn't matter which one of these parallelograms that you click first if you don't care which way the stems are, because they're both going, either one will be the opposite of the other. And then because we click the two triangles first and then the parallelograms, then the next order of patterns to click would be the two triangles again. It would kind of feel like it would make sense that we want to click from left to right to fill these. Let me show you what happens if I do click that direction. If I click this first triangle along this baseline, then you'll see which way the triangle is going to be placed.
Which is another advantage of that little pink image that you have there that we didn't have before in Creative Studio. You wouldn't know where that pattern was placed until you click the next click.
So because we tried to place this first pattern and it wasn't in the right orientation, then we really need to exit drawing and start over. So now that I've shown you the direction that we need to click, our patterns are still selected, and I'm going to place them using the head of the machine. So I'm going to mode over to draw pattern, select, and then click my first triangle. Then click across the baseline of my second triangle. The third pattern will be the first parallelogram that we selected, so we go all the way down to the tip of the parallelogram, and then up to the other side of the parallelogram. The next pattern will be a triangle, so we'll click across the baseline of the triangle, up this other side, close, and exit drawing. Now we can use our handles to adjust anything that we might need to, and it looks like if I place my machine head at the tip here, that the pattern appears to be that it's going to go right into the tip, and that the boundary is just a little bit off.
Right, I didn't do such a hot job of clicking that boundary, but that's what I love, is being able to put that crosshair right there, because I always think that you trust your clicking of your draw pattern more so than you trust where you clicked your boundary, if that makes sense, because you are clicking with the head of the machine with that draw pattern. I will usually place that crosshair right there just to double check myself, which is what you're doing, and you're finding that the pattern is good and the boundary is not so good.
Right, and the other thing that when we adjust these, then the place that we want to adjust them is usually at the point where we didn't click. So for instance, we click the baseline so we know our clicks are accurate. So we want to place our crosshair out here at the tip of this triangle and say, okay, is that accurate there, or do we need to make an adjustment? So I could lean on this a little bit, but I'm going to select the pattern, and using F8, I'm going to take the gray handle and move that ever so slightly back in there, and then move my machine head to the other corner, and select that pattern and move that in just a little bit. And we already checked this point here, so we need to just check the last two triangles.
And that's kind of the nature of custom when you're doing something like this. You know, we just wanted to be able to show them how we would make those little adjustments to be able to have a better quilting job. You will also notice that in using F12 and using those gray handles, she's not disconnecting anything. If she were using the F9 ones or the F10 ones, she'd be disconnecting patterns and teal markers would come up, and then she would have to go back and snap them back together. So doing it with those F12 handles is much better, and it's just that little bit of tweaking. You can decide on how much or how little of that you want to do, but it just ends up being a nicer product. Looks good to me.
Okay, we'll be back after we stitch these out.
We're all finished with that part, and once again we're going to hit the letter K on our keyboard, and we're going to press the word delete on our keyboard and delete that boundary, because we're just working our way through this little tote bag. I'm going back to our front design group, and what we're going to do next is the flying geese part that are in the center. Now there's two different flying geese variations. There's one that includes the sky and patterns that have the sky in them, like this one right here, or this variation of it on this side. And then there is the flying geese that does not include the sky. It's obviously going to take you a little bit longer to quilt that does not have that sky, because then you have to go back and put half square triangles in there, and that's going to be a personal preference for you. In our little tote bag, the two green ones on the left side, and we will start clicking left to right, but then you will see that our geese on the right side are reversed. So we have a little trick for you there. The first two green ones have the sky. The red one, we do not want to quilt the sky because we have made that part of our parallelogram. So once again, we're going to do concatenating, and we need to go back and mention to you that concatenating is alternating these patterns. This is why we have to duplicate the pattern with the geese on it and have that one, because if we didn't duplicate that pattern, it would do one goose with the sky and then the next goose without the sky, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to find that pattern in our pattern list, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to left click on duplicate that pattern, and you're going to see that they both come in. I'm going to go back to our quilt group, and I'm going to click out the boundaries for the flying geese. And I am doing it with the machine head. When you're clicking out boundaries for flying geese, you're going to have some double boundary lines. It's kind of the nature of flying geese. And because you're going to be clicking point to point, that's okay, because again, we're not using pattern to boundary. You just want a definition of what those geese look like, both with the sky and without the sky. So sometimes you're going to have, and you can see it on this bottom right here where I clicked twice. That's okay, because I'm going to trust, again, my clicking points and not necessarily my boundary lines. My boundaries are just going to be a visual. So I'm going to select my first pattern. I'm going to hold down my control key and select my second one, my duplicate, because it's the one with the wings. Left click on that one. Now I'm going to go and find the one that does not have wings. I'm still holding down my control key, and I'm going to select that one. And now I'm going to go to draw pattern, and I am going to do this with the head of the machine. It's a little bit more difficult to find your center. It's called a butt to beak kind of clicking, and it's a little bit harder to find your center because you see, we don't have a center reference on the bottom half of this, on the butt part of it. But because your crosshair shoots a straight line all the way across, I know that whenever I get close to the point that I need to click, I'm looking at that crosshair, and I'm looking at this point right up here to see if it's going to be right at the point of that goose. And if it is, then I know that that is pretty much where my first click needs to be. So I am going to click that by hitting select on my keypad. I am going to the top of that goose so that it does the sky. It places that first pattern. I am going to the second one and place it. And now this next one that I place should be the one that does not have the sky on it, and it is. And that places my left side. Now I need to hit that center bottom button and close that drawing. I need to move to the right side and do the same thing. I'm using that crosshair to be able to gauge where my center is on the base of that flying goose. I hit the select button one time. I'm going up to the top. It starts back over with the goose with the sky. I'm going to place the next one, and I'm going back to this one. Hit select again, and I'm going to close drawing, and I'm going to exit drawing, and I'm going to move my machine head out of the way. The first thing that I hope you notice is that they're going in the correct direction. The next thing I hope you notice is they don't sew continuously, because I have a teal marker here. These on the left side are going to sew left to right. The ones on the right side are going to sew right to left, because that is the direction that I clicked them. So what I've got to do is scroll in here really close. Now this has a gap here, and I'm not real happy about taking either one of these patterns and moving them closer with any of my handles, because they're falling pretty well in that boundary. So I'm going to use Joyce's little trick that she showed you on the triangle, and I'm going to go back and select geometric line, because if I move these, either one of these patterns, they're no longer going to fit in those boundaries. Select geometric line, go to draw pattern, and I need to have my end snap on. Not my grid snap, but my end snap. And I'm going to left click where that pink dot is, and I'm going to move over ever so slightly and left click again, because that's the next side. I'm going to right click to close the drawing and right click to exit the drawing. Now I've got myself in a little bit of a bind, because the geese on the left are going to sew left to right. They're going to stop. The ones on the right are going to sew right to left. And then I've got that geometric line in the middle. So sewing order is a mess. However, if I select the pattern that I want Creative Studio to start sewing, and I left click on order join, if all of those patterns turn yellow, then that tells me that Creative Studio will now sew those patterns without stopping from left to right, because I chose the pattern on the left first. If any of those patterns were black and not yellow, then that means that there would be a jump stitch in there, and they would not sew continuously. I can adjust them. They're still individual patterns, and I can adjust them if I want to, but they look pretty good to me, so I think we're ready to sew these out. That is just how easy it is to be able to place those patterns going the opposite direction and making Creative Studio do the work for you. So let me quilt those out for you.
So for the next row, I have clicked the boundaries already. And looking at the design group, that's these triangles here, the parallelograms, and then the two triangles. So we don't have to add the duplicate pattern in because it's still in your project because we did it on this row up here. And the only difference for this particular row in placing the patterns when you do draw a pattern is that you're clicking from left to right instead of right to left.
And if anybody's wondering why we don't just take those patterns and rotate them around, to me it takes more work to do that because the piecing is never the same. So it takes more work to take those patterns and rotate them around, and if you copy and paste them, then it's going to combine them and you're not going to be able to adjust them. It's just a lot easier to us to be able to go back and select the patterns and just click them out again.
Correct. So following the instructions that we showed you for the row up here, we're going to click and place these and stitch them out, and we'll be back when we're done with that.
We clicked out the boundaries for the white triangles, and you can see because we left the first boundary or the boundary before this one that we did, you see how that visual gets a little bit confusing whenever you look at it because boundaries are a little bit different, especially with this fabric that we're using. Wanted you to see that before we deleted it, but I'm still going to hit my letter K and hit the word delete, and the same thing applies on these triangles. We need our pattern to click from left to right on this one instead of right to left. So we're going to place those patterns in there and quilt those out. And if we go back to our design group, you can see that we left off these squares at the bottom off of our picture right here, but we're going to show you how to do them. They're really simple to do and get that done for you. And as soon as we do that, then the front will be completely finished. There's a lot of dimension on this tote bag, and it's really turning out really nice. So we're going to come right back to you just as soon as we quilt this out and show you how we did the squares at the bottom.
So I have drawn a boundary, the outer boundary, for the bottom squares and didn't feel it necessary to click the lines in between the squares because we're going to use crosshairs again. So the pattern that we're going to use for these squares is the Purl Bloom point-to-point square. And this is a really easy pattern to place. We click diagonally across the blocks. So I'm going to click on Draw Pattern, and with the head of the machine, I'm starting in the lower left corner, clicking to upper right, and then lower right of the next one, upper right, then lower right, upper right, lower right, and then close and exit. Now, as we talked about before, we know our clicking points are accurate. So where we need to place the machine head to see if we need to make any adjustments is at the opposite corners of where we clicked. So with the machine head here, I can use F8 universal again, and I'm going to use gray handles and just make sure that I'm inside that boundary. And I'm going to place my machine head in the opposite corner, and you can see we've got a considerable adjustment to make there to bring that inside. Then we need to adjust the second pattern that was right next to it, and this one's not bad. And the opposite corner, and just move across the blocks using the universal handles in the opposite corners from where you clicked across the quilt to make sure that you make the adjustments. So I'll make these adjustments and quilt them out, and we will have the front of the tote all done.
We have got all of our front tote bag quilted out, so I'm going to go back to this quilt group that says front. I have clicked out the boundaries for the back of the tote bag. This is your back image right here. We again are going to put this line work in first, and so I'm going to do that. But what we're going to do is recycle these patterns by selecting them and moving them over into position. I need to go back and change my grid back to 1/4 inch because remember that was our guidelines to be able to do this. What I would do then is select these patterns and move them over. I did not combine them. They are individual patterns, so I can adjust them any way that I want to by using nudge to nudge them up or position them correctly. Once that's done, I need to select the pattern and I need to toggle it as unsewn and stitch it out, because when you pick them up and move them, they are not going to toggle themselves as unsewn. They will still come in as sewn. Put them in position and quilt that out. So let me do that. We stayed in this same quilt group and we clicked out a boundary for the center. So if you look back at our design group, this is what the back looks like, and this is the pattern that we're going to place in there. Now this is a square pattern and this is a rectangular area. So if you remember from our January table runner that we did, whenever you click a boundary, and we're going to use pattern to boundary stretch, you only need to click 4 clicks because the pattern's not going to go in there correctly if you have more than 4 clicks. That's what we've done here. We're going to select the boundary. We're going to go and find our pattern and left click on it. We're going to use the little drop down from pattern to boundary and make sure that it is on stretch, and then left click on pattern to boundary, and that pattern goes in there just like it's supposed to. Now it's just a matter of quilting that out, and then the total back of the tote bag will be done, and the only thing that we will have left to do there is our accent band that is on the back of it to be able to use it as a luggage carrier or whatever you so choose to do that. So let us do that part and then we'll come back and do this part.
Yeah, just a reminder that the pattern that we're using for the back, the double crosshatch, is the same pattern that we used in the table runner in January. So if you went to import the pattern and it said it already existed, it's because it is the same pattern. We liked it and loved the texture and said, why reinvent another pattern?
We also make a collection of our skill builder patterns and call them SBC. So yes, you are going to get that this pattern already exists if it is in your database. So let us quilt this out, and then the only thing we will have left is that accent band, and we'll be done. The back is all done, and it was very fast. So now what we're doing is going to our little accent band and quilting that out. You can see that if I turn my grid off, you can see that in the picture right here. It's really cute on there, number one, and number two, it comes in really handy if you're traveling and need to hook this over the handle of your luggage. When we look at the way these patterns are placed in this particular band, what we did here and what we will show you is clicking in what we call a buttonhole fashion. And whenever you click in a buttonhole fashion, and the reason that I call it a buttonhole is because it reminds me of the sewing machines that we had, and it's kind of a blanket stitch, its own sewing machines where you have that extra group of stitching, and so that's what that looks like. So we're going to take this triangle pattern. Now whenever you click in a buttonhole fashion, you're going to get a more dense look to the pattern than you are if you were to click this diagonally. So if I go to draw pattern and I have my triangle selected and I click diagonally, and I'm just going to do a couple of these and go across just like this, and then I would go back in the opposite direction. Whenever you click in that fashion, what you're going to adjust would be these corners and these tips right here, just like you saw Joyce do that a little bit earlier. You can see from the screen that this is not nearly as dense a look as this pattern is right here. Whenever you click in a buttonhole fashion, if I move these down to this side, my pattern's still selected, so I'm going back to draw pattern. And what I'm going to click is the bottom left corner, then the bottom right corner, up to the top right. You go back down to the bottom and over, up to the top, over the top, and down the left side. That's your clicking motion. What you're going to adjust whenever you click in a buttonhole fashion is the centers of the pattern. You can see that these are really not very pretty. But that's where you would adjust the pattern, is the centers, because your clicking is in the seam line or is in the corners. So what we're going to do is go to this quilt group right here that says our accent band. And I'm going to draw a boundary, and when I draw that boundary, I am going back to our front and look at these line work patterns, and that's what we're going to place in there. So go into my accent band, I'm going to draw those boundaries, and then I'm going to go and grab that pattern and drag it onto the screen. And I'm going to use that F9 handle the way we talked about and just make it a little bit larger to be able to fit in that boundary. So let me do that for you right quick. We have our line work done on both of these little accent bands, and we're going to deal with this one on the right side in just a second. I'm going to delete these boundaries just like we've been doing, and Joyce is going to click out the boundary of our little 4-inch patches, so that we can place our patterns in there in the buttonhole or the blanket stitch fashion. And we'll show you how we're going to adjust those. Remember that when you click, draw pattern is going to keep that pattern symmetrical. So we're going to go and find our pattern. She's clicking lower left and lower right. Then she's going to click the upper right. She's coming back down to the bottom, back to the lower right again. And then on the second square, she's going across to that one's lower right. So you can see from the screen that she is clicking in that blanket stitch kind of fashion, and she's going to go all the way across this whole accent band. Once she gets over to the other side, then she's going to go across the top. Each click that she's making is going to determine how that pattern goes in and the angle that that pattern goes in, and that's why you end up with the centers not being necessarily the way they should be in the center, and that's why you have to adjust them. Very fast, very easy to do, and a quick way to do any kind of sashing or block shape or rectangular shape. There you go. Thank you very much. I'm going to scroll in. Oh, you clicked them pretty carefully, Joyce. I'm going to take this pattern, and I'm okay with that one. So let me take this one, use F8, and just kind of click this ever so slightly and adjust that. Let me go back over to this side and start here, because if I hit my greater than and less than, you have to scroll in pretty close. So if you hit your greater than and less than, that's going to make those patterns just cycle through, and it makes it a whole lot easier for you to select them. So this is what we have to do, is go around and adjust these patterns. I'm okay with that one. Put that one there. Now it's going to go to this one. You just want them to just meet ever so nicely in the center. You can use a piece of plastic grid, a piece of grid. Give me that one back, thank you. to be able to place it in the center, and I have pieces of that that are cut to different sizes if you want to just be real picky about it. So let's adjust that. Let us go around and adjust those patterns, and then we're going to quilt those out, and then we're going to go to the band on the right side and show you how we're going to do that.
For the second accent piece, we thought it would be fun, especially if you're using this bag and the accent piece as a handle sleeve for your suitcase, to put a little text. So instead of having the piece squares, we have a solid piece in the accent. In December, when we did the winter pillow, we showed you text, but the text was just placed on the CAD. For this exercise, we'd like to show you how to place text in a boundary. So we have drawn the boundary for the center, and we'll go up to Draw, Text. The boundary is selected. We're going to use a Comic Sans MS font, and the text type is block. So we'll enter the text in the text box. I think I'll do each word with a capital at the beginning. The reason I changed my mind is the small g will, I'll show you the small g, because it makes everything else smaller and the spacing is not as symmetrical inside the boundary.
With a small g, since we're putting it in the boundary, it can't go below the boundary, so it has to make everything else smaller, and so it doesn't have any choice but to do that.
Right.
That's cute, cute.
So with this, I'm happy with what I'm going to say and what I'm going to stitch. I'm going to click OK to close the setup box. I'd like these words to be a little bit smaller, so we have a little bit of space around them inside the boundary. So like Joanne showed you before, because we still have other patterns on the CAD, now I can make them a little bit smaller, and I think I will use the center or orange handles to bring it in symmetrically inside. And I think that gives me enough spacing and looks pretty good.
I think so too. Because you use the orange handles, it anchors in the center, so that means it's going to be the same distance that it adjusts on all four of them. Now each one of these is going to quilt out individually because you see all of those markers in there, but what we're doing is putting a black piece of fleece on this accent band so that we can have Statler applique, just like we did for the winter pillow in December and showed you that. So we're not going to show you actually how to do that. We're going to quilt this out and trim it up, and it's just going to be a really cute addition to our take-along tote.
Right. So the choice would be yours if you wanted to make this plain accent sleeve with the text, or to piece the squares. You don't need both.
So once we quilt this out and we trim this up, then our take-along tote will be ready to assemble and put together and put the handle on. I really hope we see tons of these things. I think it's a really useful piece of luggage or tote for you, and I hope we see just a bunch of these. This was really fun.
It was a lot of fun, and there was a lot of good technique on draw pattern, which we haven't touched on in Skill Builder so far. So until next time,
we'll see you then.
Alrighty.